These set of notes are from Chapter 9, Section 1, covering cellular respiration. Just to give you a little bit of background on these notes are going to just be fairly brief about the details of cellular respiration. And what I mean by that is I'm not going to be going into a lot of the heavy details because the book continues with most of those details in Chapter 9, Section 2. So I'm going to be just going over generalities, what's happening in respiration, why it's important, what do you need it for, and you don't need to worry about the level of detail this year for our class. So cells and living things need to release energy from food. Even plants need to do this. The difference, though, is that plants can make their own food, whereas you are a consumer, and that was in our last set of notes, also called a heterotroph. So you need to consume your sugars. But both plants and animals are going to need to release that the energy found in foods to power the cell's functions. Cells release energy from glucose. Okay, so remember glucose is sugar, and sugar is C6H12O6. And the name of the energy molecule that is made by the cell is called ATP. And ATP stands for adenosine triphosphate. So think of ATP as the energy molecule of the cell, and an even more simplistic way to think of it is as a charged battery. And that charged battery has the ability to do work. In the cell. So once the cell uses its little molecules of ATP, they are changed into a different molecule called ADP. And ADP stands for adenosine diphosphate. So what the cell needs to do then is recharge these little spent batteries. So it takes the spent batteries and recharges them back to ATP, and the process by which it does the recharging is called cellular respiration. Now, a nice diagram that kind of shows the relationship between ADP and ATP is the picture shown below. ATP is this little molecule here. It is broken down into ADP, but that provides the energy for the cell to do work, which is dictated or written on the right-hand side. But now you've got a dead battery or a spent battery. And you need to take that spent battery and recharge it. So we need to break down sugar to do that, and that is called cellular respiration. Now, the chemical equation for cellular respiration is the following. 6 oxygen molecules, and oxygen is O2, plus 1 molecule of sugar, C6H12O6, yields or creates 6 molecules of carbon dioxide, CO2, plus 6 molecules of water, plus, and this is kind of an average, it can vary from this, but for the sake of our class, we're going to just say this number, 36 ATP. And remember, this is energy. Now, cellular respiration and photosynthesis work together to form a complete energy cycle, as shown in the picture below. Photosynthesis takes sunlight and using water and carbon dioxide as the reactants produces sugar and oxygen gas as the products. But then in turn, glucose and oxygen are the reactants for cellular respiration, yielding carbon dioxide and water as the products. So respiration and photosynthesis make their own energy cycle. Plants can perform both photosynthesis and respiration, whereas animals can only perform respiration. They cannot make their own sugars. It should be noted that in addition to ATP being produced through cellular respiration, heat is also generated, which is a wasted form of energy that is radiated out into space. Now, in the presence of oxygen, cellular respiration is done in an organelle called the mitochondrion. Which was shown up here. This is a mitochondrion. Mitochondria is plural, mitochondrion is singular. And I am going to, again, just kind of briefly go over these steps, but without not a lot of detail. So if you take an AP biology class or a higher level biology class in the future, in college you'll learn more of the details. But respiration always begins with a process called glycolysis. And literally, this can be broken down into glycolysis, which means sugar splitting or sugar breaking up. As mentioned before, glycolysis is going to occur in the cytoplasm. So we haven't even gotten to the mitochondria yet. And glucose is essentially broken down into two through several chemical reactions into what's called pyruvic acid. Pyruvic acid is a 3-carbon compound, and just by breaking down sugar into pyruvic acid, 2 ATP are going to be produced. So the store has now banked 2 ATP. The cell has now banked 2 ATP. And then if oxygen is present in sufficient amounts, glycolysis is going to lead to a pathway inside the mitochondria that's going to release a lot of energy. If oxygen is not present enough, glycolysis is going to be followed by a different pathway. So I'm going to start there. What if there is not enough oxygen present in the cell? It depends upon the organism. So if we're talking about some lower level organisms, a great example is yeast cells, and these are yeasts under a microscope on the right hand side. Glycolysis is followed by what's called alcoholic fermentation. And in alcoholic fermentation, pyruvic acid is used to make ATP, carbon dioxide, and alcohol. Now we, humans, have utilized alcoholic fermentation to make a wide variety of food products. Good examples are bread and beer. And we take yeast, we give it sugar, and we get carbon dioxide and ethyl alcohol as byproducts. Now, carbon dioxide is used for bread because this is what makes bread rise. And that's where you get all the little holes in the bread. You might wonder, well, where does the alcohol go in bread? When you bake it, it is burned off in the oven, so the alcohol is gone. Now, in organisms like us, we do not perform alcoholic fermentation. You take pyruvic acid, and if there's not enough oxygen present, you make what's called lactate or lactic acid. And so this is called lactic acid fermentation. Perhaps you've heard of lactic acid fermentation in KW or in a sport. Lactic acid, it can cause painful burning in your muscles. And that has nothing to do with a tear or any damage. It's essentially what causes cramping. So, both alcoholic and lactic acid fermentations do not require oxygen. They are just going to happen in the cytoplasm, breaking down pyruvic acid, and so we call them anaerobic fermentation. Now, this is not typically what your cells would like to happen. Your cells would not like to be performing anaerobic respiration. I'm sorry, and I meant to write anaerobic respiration, not fermentation. Your cells want to be using oxygen because that's going to get the most amount of ATP, the most bang for your buck. So what normally will happen is the cell does have enough oxygen present to then move the pyruvic acid into the mitochondria and continue to break it down. Those processes are called the Krebs cycle, which is going to happen first, and the electron transport chain, which is going to happen second. In the Krebs cycle, and again, I'm going to put a little bracket over here, and I'm going to put in the mitochondrion, because glycolysis and fermentation would happen outside of a mitochondrion. In the Krebs cycle, pyruvic acid will enter the mitochondrion, and through a series of chemical reactions, again, you don't need to know the details, it's broken down into carbon dioxide. And that is going to be our waste product. So just remember that carbon dioxide is CO2. And this is going to be breathed, you're going to breathe this out. So that's how you get rid of the CO2 that you make from respiration. You exhale it out into the environment. 2 ATP are going to be produced from the Krebs cycle. The second process in the mitochondrion is the electron transport chain, and it's okay to abbreviate that ETC. In the ETC, oxygen is now going to be used. And through a series of reactions, it is going to make water as a waste product, and 32-ish more ATP are produced. Now that is a lot of ATP. So I'm going to underline 32 because 32 is where, again, we're getting the most bang for our buck. We're going to use oxygen, and in the ETC, we're going to get a much more or a much greater amount of ATP. This is known as aerobic respiration. Because oxygen is being used. Again, wasted energy is given off as heat, which is why you feel warm after exercise. Not all of the energy produced is going to be used to make ATP. Some is going to be wasted energy as heat. Now, looking at the picture below, this is just an overview of all of the steps in breaking down glucose. Again, there's way more here than you need to know. I'm going to cross off some things, so you don't need to know some of these molecules like acetyl-CoA or NADH. Those are carrier molecules that, again, you'll learn more about if you take a higher level of biology. But for our class, we just need to know the basics. So step 1, glucose is broken down through glycolysis to pyruvate, and this is going to happen in the cytoplasm. If not enough oxygen is present, then anaerobic respiration occurs in the cytoplasm, making lactate, or if we're talking about a yeast cell, alcoholic fermentation, which is going to make alcohol and CO2. Now, if there is enough oxygen present in the cell, pyruvate is going to enter the mitochondrion, and this is going to be aerobic respiration. The Krebs cycle will happen first, and carbon dioxide is our waste product. Remember, that's going to be exhaled. And 2 more ATP are going to be made. And I'm going to actually just quickly go back out to glycolysis. 2 ATP are made from glycolysis. And then our final step is the electron transport chain. So I'm going to put 3 there. Oxygen is going to be used. So again, this is aerobic respiration. Water is our waste product. But 32 more ATP are going to be produced in the ETC. So when you sum up all the steps together, and again, this is approximate, it's going to be roughly 36 ATP from all the steps combined. And that's our summary of cellular respiration.